So, he's James.
That's Kevlin.
And this is the way the future was. And I think that for those of you who consider your growing upness to have happened in the 20th century, for those of you who don't, this is a history lesson. But for those of you that do, there's going to be a bit of reminiscing, but also it's kind of like, let's reevaluate where we are. How was it going to be? Yeah, video phones. I mean, how cool is that? So there are a bunch of things that we were promised. Remember the jetpacks, the flying cars, airships. It was all going to be airships. Utopian cities, these clean, beautiful, everything works, and it's just awesome. We're going to have world peace, maybe even world government. It was going to be post-scarcity. It's all post-colonial. It's just like we're going to have this era of enlightenment. We're also going to get a whole load of stuff going on in space. And we are going to have the space planes, the tourists, the hotels, as well as the stations. We're going to have moon bases and robots, AI and the metaverse when we nudge into the 1990s. So it was all good. And beyond that, we were promised, the vision of science fiction gave us, this federation of planets. And it's also post-scarcity. The whole Star Trek thing, no cash. And it's just like, this is fantastic. And it's just all of the problems that people characterized in the 20th century. But it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just Star Trek. Star Trek was 1960s and that vision maintained. We get Ian Banks, the late Ian Banks, unfortunately.
Yes, the late Ian Banks. I was going to talk of the United Federation of Planets. I was hoping this chair was a bit smaller so I could do the Riker maneuver.
Yeah, if you know the Riker maneuver. Yeah.
Unfortunately, for those of you who don't know the Riker maneuver, Commander Riker in Star Trek Next Generation, he used to sit on the chair in a weird way, and it became a bit of a meme.
Yeah.
Dismount like that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But instead, Instead, yeah. And James and I have nerded out about Ian Banks and the culture in various airport lounges and things.
Yeah, over many years. So Ian M. Banks was unfortunately, as you say, a British science fiction author who wrote a series of novels set in the distant future. Well, set in this civilization called the Culture, if you haven't come across this. So the Culture was a really interesting place in these novels. The Culture is sort of full of trillions of humans, of human-like or human-type species, alien species, scattered all over our portion of the galaxy. In general, it was kind of maintained by a set of, super smart artificial intelligences called minds. And in the Culture, essentially, it is another example of a post-scarcity economy, post-scarcity civilization, where essentially the only role of people, of humans, was to have fun or have hobbies. Because everything had been automated away. Everything had been automated by lower-level intelligences, such that the only thing left for people to do was have hobbies and have fun. Again, there was no money. Money is seen as crass, like kind of boring, that kind of thing in the Culture.
It's a stage that you go through and then you grow out of it.
Yes, yeah, money is this stage. And it's this sort of very utopian, again, view of the future that was, I guess, in the 90s when he was writing. It led to this phrase, which I'm not sure you've come across before, fully automated luxury space communism. Right? Everyone is equal. Right? The artificial intelligences are equal with biological intelligences. There is no such concept of money. You can change gender by thinking about it, which is an interesting idea. So you can institute a viral change. And in the Culture, it's normal to spend some time as one gender, some time as another. Most Culture citizens will have a baby themselves and then maybe switch to another gender. And there's an interesting knock-on effect of that, which is that if, as a thought experiment, Ian and Banks said, when I was thinking about this, it became obvious that as a society, you'd end up with an equal mix of sexes. Because if you didn't, you'd have a predominancy of one sex over the other sex, which is kind of a fascinating thing. Because if one sex was treated badly, then you'd obviously migrate to the other one. Anyway, fully automated luxury space communism. So that's another sort of utopian view of the future.
Now, a lot of these kind of visions, we need to recognise our own personal perspective. You know, we are middle-aged white guys.
Yeah.
We are both British, and we, therefore, we grew up in the West. We grew up in a Cold War era. So, was this kind of vision of the future just something that was isolated to that particular portion of the world? It turns out, no, it wasn't. Behind the Iron Curtain, there was also a positive vision. Obviously, it was framed a little bit differently, but there was an idea of the future and looking up to the future. It was a deeply optimistic one, and again, it was this idea of like all our needs will be met. It was a very positive view. It had different flavorings, and so here's this thing. This was a fairly common idea, and it had been around since before the Second World War, but post-Second World War, it really picked up. Vannevar Bush and a number of other people were kind of responsible for giving us this vision. And so here's a book from, well, it's not a book from my childhood, it almost is a book, and it kind of is. I will explain.
It's from my childhood.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not, I'm not being that old. It's just, this book is a new packaging. The Future, the Usborne Book of the Future, a view from the 1970s of the year 2000 and beyond. And this is really interesting because it's one of the most interesting repackagings, because I have the original 3 books from 1979. So this is, by the way, if you're thinking about how to deal with your legacy system, this is how to do it. You just take it and just wrap it up and say, hey, those books are out of date. No, they're not. They're a view of the future. This book is a history book now. Now, here's the thing. When I showed these books, as a kid, I just used to look through the pictures and the possibilities. This was fantastic. And I just remember every one of the images in the book. And I showed this to my oldest son over a decade ago when he was about 11, 12. And he just started looking through them. He said, this is amazing. I said, yep. He was born this century, and he's sitting there going, well, this century looks a little bit different. But also, he said, why don't we have books like this anymore? And I kind of thought, oh, that's kind of interesting, because it's not just me being old guy, kind of like, oh, yeah. It was actually, I looked around, I looked at the bookshops and what was on offer, and it turns out I have a bunch of books like this, and they really aren't there anymore. So this is the blurb. Take a trip back in time to 1979 when the future was a bright, shining place full of amazing advances and wondrous ideas. What happened with that? Now, here's a really interesting thing. And we were going through this book. James came over to Bristol. We kind of went through stuff. The thing that each of the sections has is a little chronology of the future in the back, and this is fantastic. So we'll pick some extracts here. So let's just deal with the last century and the remainder. So 1980 to 2000, what are the things that we could expect? Okay, and you'll see some of these things, and you'll go, oh yeah, some of these things arrived a little bit later, some of these things go, oh, okay, 3D printing in the 1990s, that's kind of a thing. 3D TV. Yeah, didn't quite work out. So there's a whole load of things going on. Machine vision and learning, that came in really quite early. And then here's the thing. We're halfway through this interval. 2001 to 2050. What else are we saying? Oh, fusion power. Just 10 or 20 years away. They've been saying that for, yeah. But space stations had all of this stuff. Look at this. Bases on I was promised a moon base. I was. Orbital junkyard ring. The book was not just purely positive. They said that this could happen. But sea cities and robot cars. It's just, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then we move further into this century. Machine intelligence runs the world. All factory jobs. Now, this is really interesting, reading this from where we are now. Because when you read it in this book, it was just like, it was benign, it was positive. The idea, well, why would you want all factory jobs automated?
Well, it's because we can spend our time engaged in luxury space communism, surely.
Exactly. Notice how much spare time you now have compared with how much you had in the past. You have so much time you can come to conferences. You know, you are sitting there and you're working maybe 2 days a week, and the rest of the week is this abundance of luxury. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. That didn't quite work out. But at the same time, I'm not going to say it was all rosy. People did have dystopian visions. Kind of fairly classic one. Flying cars, Blade Runner, early 1980s, within 3 years of that book. But back in the 20th century, dystopian vision was much more stylistic. Sometimes people would be exploring a theme. It was an aesthetic. And sometimes they were exploring a hard question.
And a warning, often.
And sometimes, yeah, it was a warning. Please, don't do this. This is not a handbook. This is a warning. And that's the whole point, is that normally they would take a theme and say, let's just turn all the dials up and say, this would be really bad. But these were very specific. And when people were talking about the end of the world, it was very predictable. The end of the world, growing up in the Cold War, there was a very clear possibility here. It was there was this sense that, we're either going to wipe ourselves out completely, or as a species, we're going to get past this and grow up, and collectively, the century that we were promised will arrive. Okay? In other words, it's this idea if we get past blowing ourselves up, surely things will get better because we will collectively have grown up.
This is one of the solutions to something called Fermi's paradox. Don't know if
who's come across Fermi's paradox?
Fermi's paradox.
Enrico Fermi?
Quite a few people, not everyone. It's worth explaining then. So Fermi's paradox is summed up by the question, if we live in this unimaginably huge universe with unimaginable numbers of stars and then planets orbiting those stars and unimaginable number of galaxies, where is everyone? That's what Fermi said. We've had billions of years for life to evolve everywhere else. Where is everyone? And one of the solutions to that is, as Kevlin, you said, is that most life doesn't get past a particular point. It destroys itself, which is a rather, I guess, depressing solution to Fermi's paradox.
So this was the fear. I mean, I've got to say, these days, I did say a few years ago to my kids, it's just like, it's difficult to describe the whole growing up in the Cold War thing. But, these days now you get to enjoy that feeling yourself.
Yes.
But then, so there we are, we're doing all of this, and then this happens. And it's a domino effect. And the 1990s arrives. And it's just like, oh my goodness, we've done it. It's all over. And there's this wonderful quote from Darren Aronofsky, the filmmaker, recent interview for his new film, Caught Stealing, which is worth a watch. The 90s were such a remarkable time. And it's just like thinking back, it's one of those things my wife and I sometimes do. It's like, yeah, actually, it really was. There was a whole thing going on there. Exciting time to be alive. It was a lot more loose. There was a sense of innocence. Innocence is there to be corrupted, as we have learned. The Soviet Union was gone. Climate change wasn't on 99% of people's minds. And the big scandal, it's really hard to imagine. It was apparently, Bill Clinton having an affair was a really big political deal. It's just, that is the very definition of a drop in the ocean these days. People were looking forward to the new millennium. It was going to be the Jetsons. It was going to be sci-fi. We weren't all living in a state of existential terror. And it's just like, you know what? He absolutely nailed it. And there was this whole sense that the 90s was, okay, we've now got to the point things are going to start fulfilling. So anyway, James and I, that's the talk, isn't it, basically?
That's it, we're done. Yeah.
But fortunately, it turns out we have another talk for you.
Yeah.
That is the way the future was. This talk is actually composed of 4 talks. Let us move on to the second one, which is the way the future is. You may or may not have come across this. It was originally a tweet. It's a classic. Yeah, some of you are chuckling. You know this one. So James and I talk a lot about science fiction, and this is like an absolutely classic, and you keep seeing this all the way across the industry. Sci-fi author, in my book, I invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. Bunch of tech bros. At long last, we have created the torment nexus from the classic sci-fi novel, Don't Create the Torment Nexus. And it's just like, you have just summed up so much technology of recent times. And And there's this shift. We've got this kind of shift, if you like. I started thinking about it when we were talking through it. Is that if the future were a product and it was a commodity and it was being sold to us, who was it for? There was the sense that the future that we were being sold was for everyone. It was going to be for all of us. The wealth disparity would disappear, that we were all going to enjoy this beautiful, luxurious thing. But now we've arrived in it, it turns out that it's actually for very few people, all of that stuff. It turns out that most people, the thing that many of us call a dystopia is actually an everyday experience for a number of people in the world. And it turns out that the future was for a minority, a select few. And that wasn't quite how we imagined it. The idea of the dystopian thing has moved from being an aesthetic and a theme to being the way that people talk about things. In other words, back in 1975, if you were talking about the year 2000, it was quite exciting. Here in 2025, 2050 does not look exciting. And my wife and I, we had this conversation. We thought we'd have a chat with younger members of the family. How do you view the future? And it's just like, actually, they shared that view. Again, we were just vibe checking to just check that it's not just us being old people, but actually it turns out there is a very different feeling to it. So some of the imagery and the opening thing, this is a Stanford torus. The one that you see on the intro is what's known as an O'Neill cylinder. These are explorations of the idea in the 1970s of actually we could live in space. And again, the beautiful modernist, it's all nice and clean, and this is for everyone. This genuinely was this idea that we would all migrate, all levels of society could live in space. And then, has anybody seen Elysium? Okay, Neil Blomkamp movie. If you saw it when it came out in 2013, I strongly recommend watching it again. Because it was a good film in 2013. It is shockingly relevant in 2025. I rewatched it again a few months ago. I'm part of a book club called the Utopian Book Collective. So, yeah, you can kind of guess what we do. But we also revel in dystopias. And so here we have something that is beautiful and clean and everything, but it's like a gated community. It's a strictly enforced wealth disparity. So we've got this issue that all of these things, all of that spare time, all of that potential wealth that could be for everyone, it's not.
And I think we've heard actually at least 2 talks, the keynote yesterday and I think Holly's today, about this idea of Jevons paradox, the fact that with the increased efficiency of the use of resources comes this increased consumption, so additional use of resources. Now, the interesting thing, going back to the start of this, we were talking about automation. We were talking about how that was going to give us all free time. That was going to help us be able to spend more time with our families or do whatever it is. Have a John Maynard Keynes 15-hour working week. But actually, Jevons paradox says something different. Actually, what's happened is as we've become more efficient at doing stuff, as we've become more effective, we end up doing more. We create new jobs that take the place of the jobs that have been automated away. And we're always getting busier, which is a kind of an interesting thing, because you'd think we should be aiming for. Yeah. We are. I mean, I'd like to spend less time working.
I'd like 15 hours a week. Sounds great. And in fact, there's the late David Graeber. He had this wonderful observation. If you've ever come across the phrase "bullshit jobs," that's him. He basically said that what we've done is we've filled the void with jobs that are absolutely meaningless from a point of view of cultural and personal fulfillment. So we're plenty busy, but it's mostly bullshit.
If you want to look up Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's a great example of that in there. You can look up something called the Golgafringian Ark ships. I'll leave that as homework for the class. Yeah,
and so there's a point there. This is not a keynote where we're taking questions, but give us a couple of drinks and we will talk the ear off you, and we will talk about Golgafringian B Ark.
Golgafringian B Ark, exactly, yes. I don't want to be too pejorative, so I won't mention any more on stage at the moment, but yes. Anyway, so the interesting thing is we're seeing this in terms of Jevons paradox, in terms of us, how much more we're working. We're also seeing this in terms of things like being applied to thinking about Gen AI and things like token usage. So here's an example that I found. There's a reference somewhere, how DeepSeek provides a perfect example of the Jevons paradox. As the cost of tokens comes down, the demand doesn't come down at the same rate. There's also another interesting thing here with the working week, right? So this is from a paper about weekly working hours and AI exposure. And it shows that, in fact, people who are more exposed to Gen AI and use it more in their jobs end up working more. It's another example of Jevons paradox, right? You get more done, which is great. So you want to get more done. So on average, people are spending a few hours, 2 to 3 to 4 hours a week extra doing work, when they're more exposed to using Gen AI. That's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Where's this automation going? We're creating all this code, but actually we're working longer hours to create this code using Gen AI, using coding tools. That's the Jevons paradox. There's also an interesting thing when it comes to the economics of dystopia, I guess, or utopia. So I'm fascinated by agent-based models. I know everything is agentic these days, but it turns out there were agents before agentic, right? There was these things called agent-based models, which you can use to simulate the real world. If you've heard me talk about complexity, I do a lot of sort of modeling with these things. One of the interesting things you can do with agent-based models is you can create little microcosms of the economy, and you can test out certain ideas about how the economy works. And that's what some people did. They created this model which sort of modeled capitalist exchange of goods and services in an agent-based model. They found some interesting things. There's another thing about agent-based models or complex systems where they undergo what's called a phase transition between two different states. Right? So in this case, it's about how ferromagnets go from magnetized to not, and there's this kind of cliff where the phase transition happens. But you can model these complex systems, as I say, in agent-based models. And what they found when they modeled this capitalist view an equilibrium view of economics using agent-based models is that every single time you start a model with an equal distribution of value, if you run the model and the agents randomly exchange value, you'll always end up with one agent with all the value and all the other agents with none of the value. Essentially, all the value flows in this system through to a single agent. Then they thought, that's interesting and scary, right? But does it look like the real world? Does it model the real world? And these models are only useful if they model the real world, right? If you can tell you things that are useful. So they thought, well, why don't we put the different controls in from the different Western democracies, capitalist controls, market controls. And that's what they did. And they found this interesting phase transition. So this graph here is showing the line is between no oligarchy and oligarchy, essentially. And the dots represent, obviously, all the different countries. And what they found in the system is when you put the market controls in, you can simulate, essentially, the Gini coefficient of each of these Western societies. The Gini coefficient is the difference between the ratio between rich and poor in society. So using this model, they can essentially show that unless you have market controls, capitalism will lead to 5 people having everything, or 1 person having everything. I don't know if that sounds familiar, Kevin? Kevin?
No. I'm too busy hanging out on Elysium to look down on you plebs on Earth.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
No, I'm not. Yeah.
Or if you add these market controls, you can end up on this phase transition between the economy being an oligarchy or not, or society being an oligarchy. And in fact, it's pretty much only the Netherlands, out of these countries that were modeled, that is not heading towards an oligarchic state. Again, terrifying. I blame David Bowie, by the way. I don't know if, has anyone else heard this? It's all David Bowie's fault. When David Bowie died, essentially the universe bifurcated. And there's one universe where he's still alive and it's all great. But we live in the one where he's dead and it's not so great.
Yeah. No, it happened. You check it. You know, beginning of 2016. 2016 is when it all went wrong. Yeah. So we're British. We know this for a fact.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. Although there was a funny thing. I was at a meeting, I've got to just get this in, sorry. I was at a meeting with one of the European banking regulators a couple of weeks ago, and it was like 15 different countries from around Europe. It was like the European Central Bank, the Bundesbank, etc. And I had to stand up at the front and go, yeah, no Bank of England then. Oops. We messed that one up. Yeah, so, I mean, there's this kind of idea of consumption. People want to consume more and more. You come across the idea of a von Neumann machine. A von Neumann machine is like a self-replicating robot that will eventually, after running for long enough, turn the entire universe into copies of itself. Going back to Ian Banks and the culture, he sort of has this lovely quote, probably only humans find the idea of von Neumann machines frightening, because we half understand and even partially relate to the obsessiveness of this ethos that this sort of embodies. This kind of this want for more, consume.
Yeah.
He goes on to say, an AI, in his case these minds, would think the idea mad, ludicrous, and perhaps most damning of all, boring.
Not fun.
He probably would have used the word mid now.
Yes, that's true. So there's this whole notion that we should kind of consider. So we're exploring this kind of economic aspect. Is this term that gets thrown around? People often talk about a post-scarcity culture, or we could reach a post-scarcity. What was interesting to me is a few years ago, I suddenly realized we keep talking about that as partly an inevitability, but also post-scarcity. What does that mean? It means that everyone's basic needs are met. That there's no starvation, there's no poverty. Medical needs are met, educational needs are met. All the needs for support and housing are met. And it is just, the funny thing is that if you actually look at how much stuff and all of the categories I've described, there's enough for everyone. 8 billion people sounds like a lot, but it turns out we have actually more than enough for everyone. We are actually at a post-scarcity stage. It's just incredibly badly distributed. And so their point there is that that's not a magic thing that ultimately will reach production that allows us to do that. It turns out it's not a production issue, it's a distribution issue. And so, again, it goes back to this. There's something else going on here. So there's this Yulia Novakovich. She's a Czech science fiction specialist. She's also a scientist. And she made some observations. She said we should have a permanent human research station on the moon by now. So that's the moon base we wanted. But she's also, let's actually shine a light on some of the positive stuff. I'm also in awe of what we have accomplished. Because 50 years ago, nobody imagined that we would have confirmed the detection of thousands of planets orbiting other stars. I think that is so insanely cool. And it's just like, that really wasn't the thing that I was expecting to know by 2025. And we detected the first exoplanet in the mid-90s. And here in 2025, we have so much knowledge, and there are so many of them. They defy cataloging almost. So let's look at some of the stuff that we have now, here in the 2020s, that is, let's put it another way. If I were to sell, so here's James, he's living in the 1970s, and I'm living in the future, and I'm going to say, hey, James, look, here we are in the mid-2020s. I'm going to sell this to him. I'm going to say that we've got stuff like a global satellite network. There are thousands of satellites. They form communication. We know exactly where we are. Okay? We don't know why we're there, but we know where we are. GPS. We've got AI. We've got all of this kind of stuff. Handheld computing. Look at this. This thing is insane when you think about it. This is astonishing. We have video phones. We walk around with them. We sit in front of them. We've got electronic money. We've got all of this stuff. This is absolutely insane. Now, not all of it is evenly distributed, and some of these things are only kind of like when we say space stations plural, thank you, China,
yeah.
For Tiangong, because otherwise it's just the ISS. But we've got some of these things. Quantum computing, kind of, but we do have it. We've got some of these things, and we're not all running around on monorails, going from A to B on maglev trains. But, and there is kind of a space tourism, but it turns out you need a remarkable amount of money for it. But
and if you go twice, like Charles Simeone did, an even more remarkable amount of money.
Loyalty points, yeah. So, but on the other hand, he does deserve to give penance, because he came up with Hungarian notation.
He did.
For those of you who are too young to know what Hungarian notation is, we are not going to explain it to you. You don't need to know that crap. It doesn't need to be in your code. Thank you. Okay, I think the talk's done. We're good.
Yeah,
that's
we're
great.
off,
Yeah. Okay, but also, here we are in 2025. Let's remember some things. May they rest in peace. Supersonic commercial flight. Yeah, that's not a thing. Space planes. Shuttle retired a decade and a half ago. The metaverse. That is dead as a doornail. We're coming back to that one. Smart glasses. Whoa, yeah. Consistent social progress. That's faltered.
There's some interesting things on here with it. Supersonic commercial flights. So where I grew up in South Wales in the UK, it's on the flight path for Concorde, when Concorde was flying. And you could set your watch by it because every day it was when it was allowed to go supersonic. And so you'd get this boom every day in school, about 1 PM, like genuinely. So there's, you don't hear the boom anymore, right? We've lost supersonic commercial flight. The interesting other thing is the other common thing we'd hear, because we had a lifeboat station quite close to us. And back in the day when I was growing up, lifeboats used to be summoned by, the crew would be summoned by a parachute flare called a maroon.
Oh, cool.
So you'd get this boom and this bang, and you'd hear the noise, and you knew at night that was the lifeboat being called out. So on the one hand, we haven't got supersonic commercial flight. On the other hand, the lifeboat crew don't need parachute flares to communicate with one another anymore. So,
yeah. So, this kind of gives us talk 3. The way the future comes to be. Obviously, we've already hinted at that, the economic structure. But let's actually look at, we've hinted at the general economic themes, but let's actually actually follow something through and actually see how it plays out in the social sphere. So, the metaverse. I said we'd come back to it. So, 2021, Mark Zuckerberg renames Facebook and does a whole, we're going to just reorganize around the metaverse. And he said this in 2021. In the metaverse, you'll be able to do almost anything you can imagine, like get together with friends and family, work, learn, play, shop, create. It's really nice he joined us at that party because we were kind of already doing that. Because let's talk about this. It's just, this is one of the worst pieces of marketing in history. We're going to let you do what you already do, but with really janky, headache-related graphics, and it's going to be really awkward to use. And by the way, legs, you don't have them. So let's look at the timeline. So first of all, Snow Crash. This is Snow Crash's quintessential cyberpunk novel. Cyberpunk is it's kind of a strand of science fiction with a dystopian kind of future industrial element emerged in the 1980s. People like William Gibson and Bruce Sterling very strongly associated with it. And Neil Stephenson effectively we had Neuromancer from William Gibson as being one of the landmarks of the 80s, but one of the landmarks of the early 90s was Snow Crash, where the term metaverse was used. And so we had that. And then looked like something, actually living in a virtual space that was 3D oriented in that sense, okay? So Second Life came along in 2003. And in fact, if you look back at things that were happening in the 2000s, lots of references in TV and stuff like that to Second Life. There was even an episode of CSI where it takes place in Second Life. And they had to go, it was just, this is going to be the way it is. That was 2003. 2021, Zuck makes this kind of announcement. But here's an idea. The point is the metaverse is retro-futuristic because something else happened. Because the world took a different path, okay? And it's not like the crazy 2016 fork, but it is nonetheless a divergence. And it turns out that that's how we might have imagined it, but actually we ended up with something completely different. World Wide Web. This is how we do shopping. We use a catalog model. The idea of the metaverse is you're going to walk through a department store. In other words, forget one click. You're going to spend minutes wandering through and going, where the hell did they put that? Have they moved it? They have, haven't they? I don't understand it. In other words, it's one of the worst UI ideas. We solved it because you can now literally just go, done, 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 done. That's it. That's an efficiency. And then we had this massive wave of things which created the video phone in the 2000s. We're going to come back to the video phone because that's kind of an interesting one. But the point there is that's not when Yahoo Messenger existed. That's when these are all dates when they added video. And this is a really interesting one. And if that wasn't enough to seal the deal, we all ended up working from home. And hang on, let's just go back a moment. What were we doing? We were getting together with friends and family. We were working, learning, playing, shopping, and creating. And we'd already been doing that, but boy, were we doing it hard from 2020. So here's the point, that was a thought that was never taken. And that just diverged. The metaverse is just a kind of a janky, weird way of doing stuff that you now find in science fiction and forgotten pronouncements. So, where's the real value come from? What led to this?
And whilst we were chatting about these ideas and putting this together, the thing that occurred to us, I think, very strongly, was it's about connectivity. That's what changed over those periods of years. The world became more and more connected, both with satellites, as we talked about, the global satellite network, but also with things like more and more undersea cables linking more and more countries, the bandwidth massively increasing. I can get 8 megabits symmetrical at home now on fiber. I mean, I don't know what I would do with it. I mean, I could run an ISP 15 years ago after that. But the world has become more and more connected, both in terms of physical infrastructure and in terms of the social infrastructure we have around ourselves. So this is, you've probably all seen these are sort of social network graphs. They're pretty common. But the same graph would be, you could substitute the names here and put websites, and it would be the same graph, more or less. The future became this connected place, and that's what's been driving. We were thinking this is what's been driving the differences in paths that we've been taking. The fact that we're now able to communicate with each other instantaneously anywhere we are in the world. But at the same time as that's happened, we've had this weird effect where our friends and family, this is Dunbar's numbers, if you've come across these are the strength of social connections that we have between different types of, in different relationships with people. So kin is, your close family, and your very close family, and then friends is your really tight friendship group, acquaintances, and then familiars up to about 150. This is based on human evolution. This is based on the fact that we grew up in tribal societies where we relied on our very close family group to survive. And then as we expanded, as we ended up living in villages on a wider tribe. Now, the fascinating thing here is when you take these sort of relationships and splash them out all over the interweb, with totally random people all over the world becoming members of these familiars because they're in groups. I mean, I'm in a World of Warcraft guild. There's probably 5 or 6 people in that fit in my Dunbar's number, right? And I have no idea where they are. Some of them are in Norway, some are in Germany, etc. This is a great quote I got in The Guardian. It was an analysis done last, the Guardian newspaper in the UK. It was an analysis done last week about the spread of far-right disinformation through Facebook groups. And it says, you may be able to find 2 people in your neighborhood in the olden, before the birth of social networks, before this massive increase in connectivity. There might be 1 or 2 people who had the same view of you on particular things. But now you can connect with thousands all over the world, thousands of individuals who all feel the same way, which leads to this misrepresentation about what the consensus is. Just because there's 1,000 people who agree with you, that's a tiny fraction of the 8 billion people. So, previously, when we lived in these smaller groups prior to this sort of level of connectivity, these sort of views found it much harder to spread. But now, not just that, but other opinions as well. Other types of connectivity. This is a map of, I don't know why it's Texas. I got it from the US Department of Transport. It's Texas. This is freight routes, truck routes in the US Department, from Texas out through the rest of the United States. We have this increased infrastructure around things like roads, in terms of rail, in terms of freight moving by air. This continuing increase in connectivity is driving a lot of both the innovation, but also the sort of, I guess, more dystopian aspects of the society we're sort of experiencing at the moment. So this sort of infrastructure networks growing over time, the foundational aspects of infrastructure, and then these informational networks built on top of those. That's what's sort of leading us into this future.
Yeah, so there's a whole kind of like a bandwidth thing, and that whole idea that many of those things that have come about very much from beneath. rather than somebody saying that, and it is this point, in fact, given we were talking about road networks, one of the points I often like to make when thinking about such things is, what is it that makes a modern car work? And people often sort of think, they talk about the engine, they talk about various things, and it's just like, actually, it's the road. It's the tarmac. If you did not have smooth roads, cars would not look like that. People wouldn't even put speed limits up. A speed limit is a throttling. It's basically saying, it's just like, oh my goodness, the roads are way too efficient and the cars can consume as much speed as possible. So this is one for the Germans, okay? It's just like, you can go really fast. We better throttle that back, because actually that's not safe. If we didn't have roads as we do, then you really wouldn't need speed limits, because it's just like, you go any faster and you feel like the human falls apart. Don't worry about the car. So the point there is that is what enables it. The modern car is very much a function of the modern road. But all of the things that James listed, and right down to undersea cables. Has anybody actually seen an undersea cable? There's normally one or two. Yes, because you're a bunch of geeks. Of course, statistically, there's going to be a couple. But that's the point, is that everything that we do has this dependency. Likewise, satellites, the ComSat, they're a long way out. They're quite difficult to see. These are the things we cannot see, so we discount them. We underestimate their significance, but they are what enables all of these other bits and pieces that are in our hands and that we have at home. So we have a final talk for you. Okay, that's how things come to be. But the way it could be, we can't tell you that it will be that, because automatically, the minute we say that, this goes out on YouTube, 2035, you're like, hey, see these two comedians? They got the future so wrong. No.
Disclaimer, we are not futurologists.
We are not, yeah. But that's the point. We're going to tell you what it could be, okay? And so let's go back to this book. The blurb on this book, on the website, it says, after more than 40 years of science fiction focusing on dystopias and doom. This is kind of interesting, because I didn't realize it said this until after we'd discussed doing the talk. Obviously, there is a dystopian element here. It's time to remind readers, young and old, that in fact, the future is still a place that holds hope and excitement. We want to kind of try and restore that, because it seems that has gone. And I do believe that people should have that excitement that I know many of us had, but also that got us into technology. Most people didn't go, I'm going to go into technology because it's going to be really dark and dystopian, and we're going to create a worse world for everyone. We're going to shitify everything. I'm pretty sure most people didn't actually intentionally do that. So, let's talk about that future.
Actually, in the case of enshittification, I think some people did deliberately do that, because that's the business model of every platform company around the planet. But hey, moving on from that. So, if you don't know what that is, Cory Doctorow coined the phrase to describe how you get this tragedy of the commons effect with platform businesses. Look it up. So, in terms of the future, one interesting thing is how we're shifting away from one type of energy to another, right? How we're shifting away from actually what's called a closed energy system to an open energy system. So what does that mean? We're moving from closed to open. So a closed system is when we're using the energy sources that are provided by the planet itself, right? So, and we're harvesting essentially the stuff that's been created in the past, and we're using it now. There's a finite source of this stuff: oil, gas, etc. Now, the interesting thing is...
Just as an inserted point, Jevons paradox comes from coal.
Yes, it does. Now, the interesting thing with this is, previous to the Industrial Revolution, that's not what happened. We didn't dig up all this coal and burn it and oil and use that to drive our cars around. Instead, it was a very much more an agrarian society, and our source of energy was the sun that made the plants grow, and the plants fed the animals we ate, and caused the trade and things like this, right? So that's an open energy system, when we're relying on an external source of energy to provide power, energy, etc. for us. And I think that is, we are seeing that move, and this is why I think it's so important to actually keep pushing for these sorts of tools. Yeah,
our demand is significantly higher these days than it was back in pre-industrial eras. But the point is our ability to be able to extract and take advantage of all of this stuff that is actually available is also much, much larger. And it has taken a while to kind of shift that. But there's another thing as well. When we normally talk about change in technology, there's a question that we also need to consider, and this doesn't just apply to energy, displacement or addition. We often think of, when a new technology comes along, we often think that it displaces an old technology. And of course that does happen, but that is our greatest fear. Because, let me remind you, back in the 1970s when the video recorders first came out, and then in the 1980s when they became really popular and more widespread and cheaper, there was this idea that the video would kill cinema. And what we've learned is, yeah, that didn't actually happen. And in fact, it created a very different market. We can see that successfully streaming has killed video, but streaming has also not killed the cinema. There are cinemas with more screens making ridiculous telephone number kind of money from various films. It's actually created something, so it's become additive. So whilst it is true that some technologies will displace others, in many cases what we find is a new thing comes along and says, oh, it's a side-by-side. We could even talk about this from the point of view of Gen AI and developers. I think we've got over the hump where everybody said, oh, yes, obviously, Gen AI is going to replace developers. And we are, yeah, it worked out not that way already, and that was quick. But this idea of complementarity, additiveness, and we also see that from the point of view of energy solutions, which kind of means we ought to talk about fusion, because we did joke about it earlier.
I don't know if anyone saw this headline. It was from earlier in the year. So this is a tokamak reactor in China. They've now broken the record. They're up to 1,000 seconds of continuous output from nuclear fusion. That's pretty cool. You've got to say, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, but a few seconds prior to, it used to be, a few seconds. Well, it went from fractions of a second to a few seconds, and now 1,000 seconds. You're now beginning to head towards an hour.
Yeah, actually they broke their own record, which was 500 seconds previously, which, hey. But yeah, so you have this, actually we are seeing new energy sources. We now have the material science available to build a space elevator. This is genuinely true, right? We have the science is there to build it. Why haven't we? Well, this is a great quote from Arthur C. Clarke. We will do when we stop laughing at the idea, right? That's a thing.
And here's an important thing. For those of you not familiar with the whole idea of a space elevator, and Arthur Clarke is associated with this. He wrote a book, The Fountains of Paradise, basically, it's published in 1979, 1980. And it was about the construction of one on Earth. The image we've chosen here is on Ceres, the largest dwarf planet. And the idea is that very much it's a change of bandwidth, because it turns out that however good your rocket science is, it's still very, very expensive and incredibly difficult to get things into orbit and get things into space. But if you had a railroad into the sky, suddenly the costs just plummet. The ability to get humans or other artifacts and materials up and down changes the game in a way that I think we would find difficult to understand from our current perspective and our current understanding of space and satellites and so on. There's a change of bandwidth here, and it goes back to that point about connectivity and bandwidth. It makes a huge difference.
A quick sidebar on getting things into orbit. I remember being at a GOTO event in Chicago, and the keynote, the morning keynote, what was it? I think it was the morning keynote one day, was given by someone called Dr. Anita Singh Gupta.
Oh, I know Anita. Yes,
yeah.
I've interviewed her for the GOTO channel. Extra inserted thing there.
And she did this, if you haven't come across her, she was the principal investigator at NASA on the Curiosity rover, specifically the landing part of it, right? So this crazy series of parachutes and lowering a thing and then the thing flying off and things, right? So it was an amazing story. And at the end of the talk, she took some questions, and someone in the audience said, so what do you do about resilience? What happens if something fails? And she just burst out laughing, right? Just absolutely just creased up laughing. And she said, no. What you have to understand is resilience is expensive, right? Anytime you build robust, resilient systems in more than one way of doing a thing, that's weight. Weight costs money, kills space programs. She said, and this is where about 2,000 people in the room went, oh. She said, no, we use this thing we call engineering.
Yeah. Oh, damn, we've got to do the right thing in the right way. Yeah, if you've got a room full of software developers, that's not what they want to hear.
Circuit breakers, that's what we need, yeah. But then there's this other sort of increase, again, infrastructural increase, and this is kind of a Gen AI thing, but the amount of compute that's now being created, that's been added to the world, right? That's been added to existence. I mean, obviously there's a set amount of compute in the world, which is the compute that happens in human brains. But then there's this artificial compute being added all the time. And there's a great British science fiction novelist who talks a bit about the implications potentially of this in his novel Accelerando. He says, "Welcome to the midpoint of the second decade of the 21st century, human. The solar system is waking up." And he postulates that when there's enough compute, that's when the singularity will happen. And I think at the moment, I should probably look in the notes to get the numbers right. Anyway, it's about 10 to the 18 MIPS per second, so MIPS, compute for all the humans on the planet. And it's about 10 to the 17 at the moment for artificial sources of compute. So there's almost as much computing power that is artificial as is human. That's kind of interesting. And he has this idea that when you reach a certain point, the solar system will wake up. There'll be so much compute that will
raise that, yeah. So this kind of takes us into this kind of a very different kind of space, and it kind of gives us that, maybe we will get this. Maybe it won't be quite as foretold in Star Trek in the 23rd and 24th century. Because the wisdom of Jean-Luc Picard, change always comes later than we think it should. But he doesn't say that it doesn't. The other thing that we have learned through these explorations in these 4 talks, change is more gradual than we think. Okay? There are certain points that are real points of inflection, but it is overall far more gradual. And that's the idea sometimes. You need to, every now and then, just look back and just see how far you've come. And sometimes understand from your childhood what are the things you take for granted. Now, sometimes people look at it at a very personal level, and there's a whole bunch of millennials who go around, "Oh yeah, I remember as a kid I used Messenger and stuff like that," and you remember it in these personal ways. I remember how I used to have to use the telephone at a particular hour of the day because it was cheaper, and my parents would let me use that. And my kids think that's barbaric, and they're not wrong. But on the other hand, the bit that my kids really think barbaric is that you used to have to mechanically, if you really wanted to ring somebody, you really had to want to ring them. Okay, you physically move that around. These days, a rotary phone is actually a puzzle. Yeah, it's a technique for trapping young millennials and Gen Z kids. You put it in a room, you can come out if you can just get this number done. Nope, they can't do it.
Like circles of salt for vampires, right?
Exactly, yeah. So the point there is we do it on a very personal level, but the trick is take a step back, look how far you come, but also look at the breadth, because it was part of something bigger, and it gradually changed day by day, week on week, year on year. And it gradually spreads around the planet. Sometimes it means that certain cultures and so on leapfrog things. So, for example, there are countries that do not have the same landline infrastructure that we have become used to in Europe, but they've really got really good mobile coverage. Because why use the land-based thing? Yeah, that's no longer necessary, and particularly for very large countries. There's a whole idea that we don't have to go through the same stages. So it is gradual, but it is also cumulative. And that's the bit, again, we're not very good at spotting how these things add up.
We didn't get a video phone by building a video phone. We got a video phone by...
So here we have, and it's funny enough, this is a thing that Gregor mentioned on the live stage yesterday. We have flying cars in 2019 in Blade Runner. That was the vision from 1982. But we also have video phones, and they were public phones. These days, it's very difficult to find public phones in a lot of places in the West. There are places where they have been converted into other things, or they are there just for historical reasons. And you now have people on the internet going like, I'm watching this film from the 1990s, or I'm watching a TV series from the 1980s. Did you really have boxes with telephones all over the city? Or is that just a thing that the filmmaker has chosen to put in? It's like, no, that's a real thing. That's legit. And so here's the point. They projected that. And so therefore, video phone was an idea of, we take a phone, we add a video, and everything about it remains the same. the whole thing has changed. There was a recent social media thing where they got a number of women of different generations to close their eyes and then do a movement that represented an idea. And one of the most fascinating things was close your eyes and ring a friend. Somebody my generation, millennial, the Gen Z person, so bang, bang, that was how they did it. And that is the whole point. There is a fundamental shift. We don't get video phones by setting out to build video phones. These things, the whole point about that wave that happened in the 2000s with Messenger, we actually find that the video phone did not come from telephony. It did not come from the landline companies. It came from chat applications. It came from messenger applications. It came from additional apps that you could have with these. The webcam on the computer, the cam on your phone. It came from a completely different source. But the point is, if you set out, oh yeah, we're going to build video phones, all we've got to do is invent all of the technology for this, all of the distribution networks, all of the towers, and also make it socially normal. And then we can have video phones. You don't do it that way.
Excuse me. Sorry.
So, returning to this, we want to leave you with kind of a positive message about the future. Because there is a lot of dystopian envisioning for very good reason, because we look around at the present and we see various trends. But people in this room, you're technologists. You still have choice. You still have agency. The future is still ours. So we're going to leave you with one final piece of advice.
Be excellent to one another. Party on, dudes!